Yeah. Okay, so I think we're gonna start. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction in Russian, if you don't mind, and then we.
No problem.
Yeah, we're gonna start. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Так, ну что, друзья, давайте мы начнем. У нас кто-то онлайн, кто-то... Спасибо, что вы пришли офлайн, это здорово. Я очень рад, что сегодня Майк нашел возможность к нам подключиться. Если что, он находится сейчас на Бали, у него уже 12 ночи, вот, и он на самом деле переехал туда буквально вот на прошлой неделе, и следующие несколько лет планирует обосноваться именно там. Вот, у него, на самом деле, родилась не так давно малышка, вот, и они с супругой решили, что теперь, несколько лет проведут именно там, а так они базировались в основном в Лондоне, но какое-то время он проводил, естественно, в своей одной Кении. А вообще, в двух словах, Майк, конечно, потрясающий художник, мой близкий друг, и, в общем... У него, конечно, за последние 6-7 лет невероятно сложилась карьера. В 2015 году он заключил контракт с галереей White Cube, это одна из крупнейших галерей, и, собственно, с того момента его путь был наполнен множеством биеннале, музейных выставок, персональной в МОМА, в Королевской академии искусств. Но я уверен, что Майк с удовольствием обо всем об этом расскажет. Я заканчиваю отнимать у него время. Вот. Если вдруг, смотрите, у вас есть какие-то вопросы, или если что-то будет непонятно, я с удовольствием переведу, спрошу. В общем, те, кто в Zoom, пожалуйста, пишите в чат вопросы, а я постараюсь все адресовать Майку. Okay, I'm done with my introduction, and I think we can make a start. I'm gonna change the sound setting just for a second, so it's probably the sound would be better.
No worries.
To do. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there's probably a little chorus coming in from behind me as well. There's a lot of frogs here.
Just one sec. Hopefully with this sound would be better. Okay. Right. We can start.
Cool. How's that? All good?
Yeah, I think it's it's better from outside.
You guys can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's all good on my side. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me, Mitch, as ever. And thank you all who are here to listen and be part of this, for coming and joining. I thought I'd just talk through a few different paintings of mine, and it would be great if anyone does have questions as we go along, if you just either put them in the chat group or maybe get Misha to ask it as we go along if you're in the lecture theatre. It'd be nice if there's a conversation around this as we go through. But so the work I'm going to show you is basically made over the last 10 years or so. And it's not in any particular order of date, but just will cover a different variety of themes. My work is largely based on socio-political events in East Africa. That said, a lot of my painting references and other stories come from different cultures as well. To start with, in this painting, it's Midas, after the Greek myth of Midas. I don't know if you're all familiar with the myth of Midas, but Midas was a ruler who helped Apollo, and as a return for his help, he was gifted the wish that he could have whatever he wanted, one thing that he wanted. Midas was a ruler over a country that had been in drought and had been seriously impoverished, and he had this kind of good intent of wanting to help his country. And in order to do this, he asked for Apollo that anything he touched be turned to gold. The consequence of this was that the first thing he touched when he woke up after bathing in wine, which was what he was told he had to do, was that his wife and children were turned to gold. And then very quickly he realized that what he had asked for, although it was meant to enrich his country, would undermine everything, and meant he wouldn't have a family. I was kind of interested in this point of being a story of hope ultimately, and then having this apex and deteriorating rapidly. And the point for me of maximum hope was when he bathes in wine, as that's the point at which he then changes from not touching everything and it turning to gold to being able to have that ability. So for me, I wanted to set that in northern Kenya, where it's a place where there is significant drought, and you could imagine, you know, a political leader of some sort wanting to act in a way, albeit for, you know, the good of his people, but it may have a very negative consequence for them. So this is Midas as a northern Kenyan leader. And in it, I was also thinking, I'd just been to Venice when I made this, and had seen Titian's Pieta in Venice, and I was kind of interested in how he was able to use a lot of very different stylistic means of painting to tell a story, and to have different characters painted in different ways, but that provides something of the story in that. I saw that someone's asked why Kenya. I grew up in Kenya. I'm from Kenya, and when I was thinking about how to approach making work, my first thought was that I wanted anyone from Kenya, because art isn't really part of the culture at home in the same way that it is in many other places. But I wanted someone who, if they walked off the street knowing nothing about art or art history, could see something that they related to. And I thought the most immediate way would be to have people and stories that would relate to them and to their lives. So that's why Kenya has been a sort of anchor in practice throughout. Should we go on to the next slide?
Mike, can I just quickly ask, in terms of generally myths, are they studied at the school? Are they part of the cultural upbringing in Kenya or in East Africa at all? Or is it something that actually comes from more or less the West?
So Greek myths are not part of our schooling system, but we have a lot of our own kind of myths, and Kenya has 41 different tribes, and each of them have their own myths and their own history like that. Although a lot of it is oral history and isn't written, it's part of it. So that's actually another side of the work that I make, is also based on some of the local myths and stories for different reasons. But yeah, when previously there would have been a lot more of an English, in sort of post-colonial times, a lot more of an English focus to the education. Certainly the education that I had in Kenya, which was in a private English school in Kenya, was very anglicized and very English focused. But, and we did do Greek myths then, but it wouldn't be the sort of status quo for schooling.
Okay, so in that way, this in terms of connection and relation and the context, it's more not relevant, but more clear and understandable for actually the Western viewer.
That could be the case, I suppose. If you know the story of Midas, it should be. Yeah, it should be a simple translation of that story in some sense. But also, part of the thing that I liked with the story of Midas is it's used as a sort of metaphor for greed, but also for exceptional talent. for greed, because the story is that he wanted everything to turn to gold. So people have interpreted that as greed. And the other side of the story is that someone who is very sort of economically successful has the ability to turn anything to gold. In other words, they make a lot of money. But for me, it was this other side of him, which was based on wanting to do something good, but it not having that desired outcome, that was more interesting.
Yeah, sure. Can you briefly talk about the Labugo cloth as a base?
Yeah, so let's go on to the next. Let's go on to the next painting. I'll see. Yeah, we'll see if it's got something more obvious. It doesn't. But anyway.
Well, it's got holes.
So basically, all the paintings, it does have holes. Exactly, it's got holes in a seam that runs through around where the hole is. And all the paintings are made on a type of bark cloth. The reason that I wanted to paint on bark cloth is, for me, when I was making paintings like this, for example, where the language speaks to sort of artists like Manet or some sort of type of expressionism or neo-expressionism, I didn't want the work to have to be put into that category first. I wanted the work to first belong to East Africa and an East African narrative, and then have those other references if they were helpful in telling the story. So I started looking for a base material, something that would locate the paintings in East Africa, so that my paintings, from the very beginning of their making, were part of a culture over there. It took me the best part of 4 or 5 years to find the cloth, and then to also find a way of working on it that I could start to tell stories in a way that I enjoyed, but in a way that I also felt was kind of the most articulate. So the cloth is bark, and it's made by stripping the outer bark off a fig tree, a type of fig tree. That bark is then beaten, soaked, burnt, and beaten again for many, many hours until it becomes soft and like a normal cloth. The cloth is then stretched onto a stretcher, and like a canvas from there on, where it's sized in the way that you would. There were interesting things that came up that were challenges as a painter. The fact that the surface has a lot of stitches. Sometimes there are divots and dents. It provided a lot of. I learned that's exactly what usually paintings are made on. But this was really, has ended up, for all the challenges it presented, it's been 10 times more giving. And looking at other surfaces, and if I take some like Hisham, I'd never realized how many of his paintings were made up of different types of weave stitched together. For me, because he certainly would have been able to get cloths that would cover a whole canvas.
Mike, you're breaking up.
Can you hear me now?
Well, from
Can
time
you hear
to
me
time.
now?
So it's we can hear you now. Yeah, it seems to be okay right now. Yeah, it seems to be
cool.
going on and off. So, like for a few seconds, it's okay, and then for then a few seconds, it's kind of breaking up. Anyway, let's try and continue. Yeah.
Hopefully, it stabilizes a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hopefully, if it gets really bad, I can always log out and log back in. But yeah, so this painting is called Baboon, and I think it's self-explanatory. It's a baboon, and those are some bananas. Typical, kind of like a sort of Manet does baboon vibe. But yeah, to the next one. Yeah, so this painting is called Necklacing. It came after thinking about a scene that I saw when I was quite young. I was probably about 12, and I was at the cinema with my sister. And this guy came running past, and he had a tie around his neck. And he was very shortly followed by a group of people that were chasing him. And they had a fire on a stick when they were chasing him. When I was 12, it was very surreal, and I didn't really understand what was going on. But I found it quite funny. I remember laughing at the scene. And then maybe 4 or 5 years later, when I learned that that's actually a form of punishment, that groups of people will turn on a thief and put a tie around their neck and light the tire to effectively kill them, and burn them alive. That it was horrific. But I wanted to have something of the surreal nature of my first encounter with it, where it felt comic. It also is a painting that for me points towards one of my biggest influences, which is Goya. And you know, his kind of ability to turn a very critical eye on pretty much every aspect of society, but to do it with incredible humor at times, even though his subjects were incredibly dark. To be able to, for example, like one of my favorite series is the Disasters of War, and that somebody could be and have that sort of critical eye that he has in that of all sides and all parties. You know, that anyone who is perpetrating a crime in that would be depicted for that was something that was unbelievable, and I hadn't really seen that in art. And still, I don't know if I have ever seen that, where someone has kind of really taken on the humanity of incredibly difficult situations. And so here, I just wanted something of the surreal moment, and the kind of figure coming out of these bushes or something with a tie around his neck. And I had heard in South Africa, when this happens, they call it necklacing, which I thought was an incredibly benign way of describing something that's totally horrific, I think. So I called the painting Necklacing after what it's called in South Africa. Do you want to go into the next slide?
Just a quick question. So the image, it's completely taken from your memory, yeah? So it's not kind of based on any documentary photograph or actually...
Yeah, I certainly researched a lot of images, but it's totally fictional. Like this is, you know, there wasn't a guy standing like this with a tire on him who looked like this running out the bush. It is totally fictional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this
sometimes
is exactly...
I'll be
those
exactly
lines is actually the evidence of the cloth being sewn together, right? On the corner.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then you can see there are cuts in the cloth as well. One in the left-hand corner of the tire, and the other at the base of his feet.
Is this one, yeah?
Yeah, and those are just naturally occurring. I mean, I often have to think about the composition to use them, and the same with the stitching. But they're naturally occurring sort of cuts or holes in the cloth. Mm-hmm. I don't make those.
Okay.
The stitching sometimes I do make. Should we go into the...
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a painting called #MyDressMyChoice. And it came from seeing a video of these women that were on a minivan in Kenya. And it was actually happening in quite a few different places at the same time, where in a sort of form of moral policing, people usually men in the minivan, if they thought the women's skirts were too short, would strip them and beat them and molest them. And I had been sent one of these videos, and it was horrific. But I was also struck by the fact that as the woman was being pulled from side to side, she kept falling in and out of the pose of the Rokeby Venus, which is a Velázquez painting of Venus, and is often said to be one of the most beautiful paintings of a human figure. ever made. The Rokeby Venus was also and has also been targeted several times. Somebody came and stabbed it in protest and cut the painting. And so it has its own history of, as a point of reference, of being abused as a painting. And often when I choose references, they will have something specific to the story like that. You know, but this horrific act that was happening and had that, to me, that kind of closeness to what is supposed to be one of the definitions of beauty in Western figurative painting was a kind of contradiction that was interesting, as I wanted the viewer to be implicit in the act. As for me, I felt this was my culture that was doing this, and I felt complicit, as it was supposed to represent some sort of idea of morals that I was supposed to have, which clearly I don't think like that at all. So yeah, so that's kind of why you have the figure with all the feet around, and then there's a couple bush babies in the bottom corner. Bush babies for me are interesting because they have this incredible, they're beautiful, soft hands, but they make a very, very shrill noise for something so sweet and cuddly. And again, it was kind of thinking of that idea of alarm and something attractive in a way. But yeah, so that's the painting, My Dress, My Choice. And the hashtag just comes from the movement that followed it, the title. So if you clicked on a hashtag, My Dress, My Choice, you'd see different movements around the world which were against these strippings and attacks would come up, whether it's in India or, you know, Kenya or other parts of the world.
I wanted to make a point about the current situation in Iran.
Yeah.
And because it seems that there's a kind of link in a way, but I don't know whether it had the similar effect in Kenya as it had in Iran, really.
Yeah, not in the same way, because we don't have a sort of moral police. This was more vigilantes. This was just people on the streets deciding that this was wrong and then acting on it, as opposed to the government as an authority trying to enforce something. So, you know, and that sort of vigilantism we have a lot of, because we don't have the most effective police force as well. So people often try and take the law into their own hands. But it certainly has a lot, has very, very close links to this idea that one should police in a moral way the way that somebody dresses. And that responsibility always lies in the hands of the women. They're always the ones that are at fault. It's not the men who have the urges, you know, which is an absurd idea. So yeah, it definitely has a lot of very close links to what's happening there.
So you said the trigger was the video that somebody sent you, yeah?
Exactly. You could probably find it on Twitter, to be honest. If you did hashtag My Dress, My Choice Kenya, it did the rounds quite a lot. Yeah.
Right. Shall we move on? Next one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, please, sir. Yeah, and so this is this painting is called Nyali Beach Boys. I'd been thinking about doing a painting on the sex tourism that happens on our coast in Kenya. And I was interested in it because it was from the position where the prostitutes were male prostitutes serving usually elderly European women. I was kind of interested at first because I just didn't have much sympathy or empathy, I should say, because they were men. I didn't have the same sort of, you know, feeling like there was a great crime happening against them like one does for women who are forced into prostitution. And I found that problematic in myself. And so I wanted to try and take on a painting that had these links to an image within art that is synonymous with female prostitution and an attitude of objectifying the human body and the female body, but turning that into a male painting. So the painting that I chose to work with was Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, if I've said that right, probably haven't. So what I did was take the composition of that painting, and in all the places in which a figure is in that painting, there's a cut through the surface of the cloth, which I then stitched up. The painting is the exact same scale and size, and elements of this composition are also taken from that. And here, you know, it's kind of 5 guys standing underneath the wall, behind in the kind of shadows, being sized up by the viewer, who is any of you, any of us, you know, anyone who's looking at the painting, as they're all kind of showing what they have on offer, you know. And so the painting has that link to a history of making images around prostitution that was really maybe even at its height, although certainly throughout Renaissance and so on, it's been present, but at its height also through artists like Manet, Degas, you know, maybe, and then the Picassos, the whole of the Impressionist movement, where the men spent a lot of time working in brothels and using them, the women, the prostitutes, as models.
Is that why the link
to?
Is it why the link to Picasso is important?
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, Picasso is a reference that I don't often use because of the complications, sort of interpreting complications. He muddies the water a lot because of his references to tribal art from the continent, from Africa, and how that was used, and the way that it's also discredited, you know, discredits art from the continent. So I purposefully don't reference him and stuff that happened after that moment, because it just confuses the references for me, and by extent I would assume to the viewer as well. But in this, it's such an explicitly clear painting, Mademoiselle d'Avignon, that it's about prostitution, that I felt like that reference. And I think it's probably the most visible or the most recognizable painting on prostitution that exists, or certainly one of. But yeah, do you want to go into the next one?
Yeah, just a little, one more little maybe question or note. That painting was basically a start of Cubism, right? And it also was one of the strongest link to the tribal art that Picasso got really engaged with. So,
yeah, which is exactly why I don't really like going there. You know, because like there's a lot of issues with politically, sociopolitically, to do with objectifying Africans that comes through an attitude towards the art and the breakdown of the form, and also the way, you know, the sort of level of exoticism that happens, which doesn't take seriously the development of the forms in African tribal art. And also it doesn't take seriously the work of the artists and people that made those things, is also very problematic. And there are so many hangovers as well on the continent with ways of making and very problematic ways of seeing Africans by Europeans and by others, that I just, it's fine for certain moments like this where it's about an objectification of a body, it's about an objectification of a people. They are turned into sex objects, and this is also partly why I was interested in bringing some of that to it, and the way that Cubism has affected and reflected attitudes towards the continent, and within art, to art from and on the continent is super important.
And there's really kind of textured elements on the left side of the painting. Is it?
Yeah. So again, that reflects the actual the original Picasso's painting. Has
right.
that. There's a cloth that cuts the whole way along that left side where there's a seam as well. But that's also super textured and comes from trying to stretch and stitch the cloth. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's move on.
So this was again another painting on the same theme, and it's called Mangrove's Dip. And I just wanted to do this inversion, as there was a sexual inversion in terms of who was the sex object, the male or the female, that happened. So I just saw this as a moment of ecstasy for the woman who's there as the tourist, the sex tourist, and then the guy who's there is the male prostitute. And I thought of it happening in the mangroves. So yeah, so that was just to show a different point. And again, has a lot of links to, artists that looked at that stuff around the sort of modernism and impressionism and post-impressionism time,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Yeah, so this painting is called Congestina, and it's about a female boxer, Congestina Cheng, who is one of our very few world champion boxers. She had a very difficult time in the media where she was used as this form of entertainment because she suffers from like very severe mental illness. But the media would always kind of turn up, for example, when she was institutionalized, they would turn up and bring her out and interview her when she was clearly going through quite psychotic episodes. They'd put her on TV and claiming to be in sympathy with her, but it was using her as a form of entertainment. So I'd wanted to kind of make a painting that approached this. And it was, oh God, I've forgotten his name. French painter. There's a painting of a clown whose the name will come to me. You have to forgive me. It's late over here. There's an image where there's a clown standing on this central rock with all these people around him, and I wanted to reference that for her being this kind of central comic figure to the media. And it got to the point at which the media even said she was dead. And this ran in all the papers, on the news, and she wasn't. She was just living with her mother. So the media even killed her, even though she was still alive. And this whole painting was a setup around that, around people that were supposed to care for her, but weren't. Around an incredibly strong, physically strong, extraordinary athlete who was incredibly vulnerable in lots of other ways. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And has she seen by any chance the painting?
No. I mean, she literally lives in abject poverty in Western Kenya, being cared for by her mother. She has nothing. She's really,
Right.
Yeah, and she's not in a good way at all.
And those mental problems were the result of the sporting career?
Not sure. It's certainly something that was interesting to me when I was researching the painting, and I read quite a few different biographies of athletes, of boxers in particular. One of which was Mike Tyson, which is the most like brutal but extraordinary read. I mean, it's very difficult to go through to get to the end of, just because of the way he lived, and also his own issues with mental health, and also just understanding what sort of lives these boxers have had to live in order to do what they do, which is put their life on the line for entertainment's sake. It's kind of crazy. Yeah,
and I guess
the
idea to represent her naked was to show her kind of vulnerable situation for the public.
Exactly. And once again, like with situations like this, for me, it's important that the viewer is part of it, is implicated in what's happening. It's not about an othering of something, you know, and it's important where the viewer stands in relation to everything, the person who's looking. Yeah.
Right. Move on.
Yeah. So this painting is called Lacuna. I think we can even go to another one. I don't have too much to say about it.
It seems that the color palette is very subtle and light in comparison to the other works. Yeah,
it's got a kind of smokiness to the whole painting.
Any particular reason
been thinking,
why?
It just felt right, you know. I think, you know, and I think one of the other things which you'll see in some of the other paintings is thinking about how to tell multiple aspects of a story at the same time when you're dealing with a single flat image, like. And I'd been thinking about and looking at people like Picabia and Sigma Polka quite a lot, and thought that their way of what they called, or certainly Picabia called, transparencies and layering of imagery. And again, it also relates to what I was saying about Titian earlier, using a drawn line versus a painted figure, a different way of making the image to tell a different part of the story. And this is something I've done in quite a few different paintings as well. And I've been working on, particularly in recent work, even more. But yeah, so this is called Lacuna.
And in terms of layers, are there, what, like, for instance, in this work, how many roughly layers of paint you applied?
I can't remember.
Well, 5, 10, 20?
Yeah, maybe in some places up to 20. Other places 1 or 2. Yeah, God, it just depends really. So some parts are more built up, but with these I try not to build them up too much, because of the way that I want the images to move in and out, and because of the way I want the drawn parts of the paintings to be embedded in. I try not to build it up too much. You know, like the drawn elements are always the first things that go down in these paintings, and so the battle is to keep them. And I'll often use an acrylic paint for that first drawn element, because I can't rub it off with oil, with white spirit or turps. It stays. Yeah.
And as a starting point, you actually use a white primer or some color primer?
I use white primer, but then I'll often paint a base color.
And also with
different
acrylic?
Parts of it. No, in oil. No. I only ever use acrylic just for the drawn line. That's it. And sometimes I don't even do that. I just use a very, very oily oil, so it separates.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is kind of one of the biggest paintings I've made. And it's called The Paradise Edict. And it's kind of exactly what I was just saying about the previous painting with the layering of imagery. And I made it as I was sat on an incredibly beautiful island called Kiwayu, but it's next to the Somali coast, and it on the mainland, which the island in part faces. On the mainland, there's a war going on between Somali Al-Shabaab militants and the Kenya Defense Forces. It's basically, as it's incredibly beautiful, it's kind of like a paradise. And I had this idea that I'd wanted to take on some of the issues around places that are seen as paradise, and then think about paradise and landscape in a way that the idea of paradise moved at some point from being a well-kept garden, a very domestic space, to this kind of a sort of wilderness. Again, something that's quite seen to be quite unattainable in a world that's also destroying a lot of its wilderness as well. But that those wild places were often full of socio-political tensions as well. And so this was based on a study I did of a bush that looked back towards the mainland from the island. And then it has different things like one of the figures is from a Goya drawing of these, which he took in turn from Bosch's paintings of Dante's Inferno, where there are human bellows. The figures are pumped, and from their ass comes all the air to keep fanning the flames. And so in this, I had one of the figures being impaled on a palm tree, and the other one is being pumped, and snakes are coming out of his ass. And out of the asshole in the painting is also a hole. So again, that's some ways that I use the holes. I've done a couple assholes as well. But yes,
it's the painting that was at the Venice Biennale, right? So it's the one that you made.
Yeah, exactly. It was in Venice. Yeah, it's done the rounds, this painting. Yeah.
So that scale, what was it like to work on such a big format?
I loved it. It's quite, you kind of lose yourself at different points, you know, it's, or certainly I did. It was almost like, it felt like working on maybe 3 or 4 paintings separately. And then you just have to have enough distance to be able to take the whole thing in together. But because of the way that this painting was built, it felt more akin to trying to, I don't know, conduct a piece of classical music or something, where you have all these different parts at play, whether it's color or form, and you're trying to bring different aspects of the story out, and other bits recede, and you know, different things have their different part to play. And it felt really much more like that than because of the type of painting on this scale than other paintings that I've done on this scale, where it really does feel like you're working on very different paintings within the same painting.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to go to the next one? Yeah, so this is exactly the same scale, and kind of exactly like I was just saying, where it almost felt like I had 3 different paintings going on here. The kind of left-hand side, which was very populated, the center side, which was this kind of comical baboon doubling, and then the right-hand side, which is a kind of more ephemeral bit of painting. But this painting came from attending the elections in, I think it was 2017, if I'm not wrong. And I went to the last opposition election, and then subsequently was sent. I went with one of the news teams as a sort of research trip, where I was thinking about making one painting about power and how people follow a leader and what they give up in order to follow a leader, and then also what a leader himself or herself gives up to lead a people. And particularly in a country like the one that I'm from, like in Kenya, where we had a dictator for many years, and we had a very small group of people who were in power since independence. For me, it was interesting to reflect upon why and how the exercise of politics allowed for that to continue. And really it was more about the people that vote than the leaders. The leaders for me are almost comic characters that have an unfortunate but very real effect on the lives of not only their own people, but of others as well. And for me, the question was of the populace, like what are we doing as a country that keeps this happening? And I thought the elections were the beginning of a way of looking into that and trying to engage with that. So in this, there's a kind of cycle where it starts at the very back behind the arch, where it has effectively protesters. And then as you move forward, the protesters end up getting more and more rowdy and raucous. And then there's an engagement with the authorities, which is played out through the three figures that are throwing stones as there's a canister of tear gas that's been pelted at the crowd. And they're throwing stones sort of off the painting. And in the tear gas, there are sort of skeletons and so on that I was thinking would conjure up this idea of death that happens, where you get the confrontation between the authorities and protesters in some cases. There was this one case after the rally that I had been to, where so a lot of the supporters that turn up for these things, almost all of them are paid to be there. So, that's already a very dubious relationship. But then some of the people who are paid to be there turn up at everything. And they really bring the noise and bring the atmosphere. And there was this time where some of those guys had made their way into one of the slums, and there was a girl sitting on a balcony, and she was hit by a stray bullet from the police when there was a live fire exchange. And so exactly where Misha's very kindly circling, that is where she came into the picture. And actually, and she was called Mercy. She was 11, and a very, very, very dark and poetic name considering what had happened.
Did you actually see that?
No. The bit that I saw was just in the where some of the other paintings are from that. But the bits that I saw in person were from the actual rally, which was intense and pretty raucous. So this kind of, and there's a poster that one of the guys is holding, which kind of relates to Gauguin. And I was thinking of a sort of seductive ideology and the way that this kind of exoticized female nude has pervaded history as a kind of seductive ideology, that it hasn't really been questioned. Nowadays it does, but hasn't really been questioned for hundreds of years. And so that was kind of the idea behind that painting, in the way that, when I was at the rally, the leader came on stage all dressed in white, and placed himself as this sort of savior of the people. And it was such a regurgitation of political rhetoric that has been happening for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where the leaders will get up and say the exact same things and people will still follow them. It's completely absurd, and play off the desperation of their own people as well, in order to kind of benefit themselves. And so one of the figures has that poster, and then the other figure is carrying a massive dead bush rat that dangles from his hand next to the kid who's kind of got his head poking through a basket. And for example, some of what I'd wanted from going to the rally was that you're within the crowd. So when you're against this painting, you're almost one-to-one with the people. And when I was at the rally, there were these kids who were scurrying through people's feet. It was almost Dickensian like that, kind of picking stuff off the ground, pickpocketing people. All the street kids were just there trying to take what they could from the situation. And then in the center figure, there's the baboon that is often for me, a kind of points to the truth of the painting. And he sat on an open book that says the Paradise Edict, or again, that refers back to the other painting. and this promise of paradise. And the leader kept saying, I'm going to lead you to Canaan, to the promised land. Again, very familiar rhetoric about this other land that's, this better place, yeah. And I wanted to double that up and show this kind of, on the opposite side, above him is a reflection of a monkey falling out of the tree. One's so stable, and then there's something that's totally destabilized in the whole situation. But yeah, do you want to go on to the next one?
So is there something written on the paper that the baboon is sitting on?
Yeah, it says the Paradise Edict.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so this again, it's called Pathos and the Twilight of the Idol. Riffs off in each title, but for all of these paintings that were around the political rallies, it was important that the paintings were taken from actual photographs of people that were there. So I tried to make them as close as I could to, to portraits in some way of those that were there. And the group of people who were all men, basically. Well, not all of them, but mostly men, young men in their early 20s, who were the most energetic and fervent supporters, also dressed outrageously. Some of them wore clown outfit, clown hair, like huge fur. Some of them wore different types of masks. There was this guy who always wore a bikini top, sometimes wore bikini bottoms as well, and would attach slogans to him. These guys, when I was sent the photographs by the journalists that I was at the rally with, were at every single rally. And not only that, there were also the photos of them when there were confrontations with the authorities. They were the ones who were fighting them, who were throwing the stones, who were sometimes firing back. And I kept thinking about this idea of a dubious martyr, somebody who dies for a very dubious cause, as would be the case, and then is held up by whoever the leader is. And so I wanted to have a relationship with a history of image making around martyrdom. And of course, the most obvious is Christ on the cross, and so it's kind of like an altarpiece painting. And that's where this whole setup comes from, the kind of slightly nonsensical perspective from above looking down, that makes him form with his arms as they're swinging rocks, a reference to Christ on the cross. Do you want to go to the next one? Yeah, then sort of taking a step back, a couple of years back previously, I made a series of paintings around this dance called Baikoko. And I came across it through a video of a song by Diamond Platnumz, who's a very well-known Tanzanian bongo flavor artist, one of the most well-known pop musicians on the continent. But he started using Baikoko, this dance, because it's incredibly sexual. Tanzania is a very conservative place, so in their videos they weren't allowed to show any form of nudity at all. People had to be covered, and this was a way for him of bringing a sexual element into music videos. And then it really took off, and people started to do other types of much more explicit dances. The dance itself was actually a very traditional dance that was usually reserved for women, where they would only dance with other women. And often mothers would, and it would happen at wedding celebrations, and mothers would check out the way that other girls dance to see who would be a good suitor for their sons. But Diamond Platnumz really elevated this into the pop realm, or moved it into the pop realm, I should say. And again, the only men that are present at this dance normally would be the musicians. And so there's a drummer on the right who has one of the women kind of standing, shaking her butt while kind of on his drum. And so the painting obviously has very clear links to Gauguin, and I was thinking about this sexualization of the female figure in painting, in the history of painting, and also that relationship to witchcraft and something that's banned, which comes up in probably the next painting, if I'm not wrong. Do you want to go to the next painting?
The pose of the women is quite explicit, isn't it? Well, I mean, I know that they're dancing, but the way that they're positioned.
Yeah, totally. And it's all taken from the music video. So it's all from research that I did around there, where there's someone called Mukami Korea who I work with quite closely on other projects outside of painting, but I got her to write a paper on Baikoko, and we made a short little video documentary piece on Baikoko. So all the figures are literally taken from either that film, that music video, the Samanawe, or other things. I think the next painting is also Baikoko. Yeah. So this again, when I made the drawing from that music video, I was struck by the fact that the poses of the women really resembled the way that Goya drew witches in flight. And that relationship to witches, where, like with the way that the Tanzanian government wanted to prohibit and ban the use of Baikoko and its existence, they banned people from using it in music videos and so on. Kind of reflected upon this idea of female sexuality and that link to witchcraft in Western culture and Spain. And I was kind of taken by the fact that it was just total coincidence when I made the drawings of the figures and they were isolated in a white sheet that they looked like they were flying. So I kind of took this, thinking of Goya's painting, Atropos, the Fates, and, made them fly, basically. Yeah, and so the kind of references Gauguin as well as Goya in its making.
Right. Next one.
Yep. Yeah, this is a painting called Impeccatoni. We can probably go on to the next one as well, unless anyone wants to ask about it. But it's a group of women during not the last World Cup, the previous, I think it was in 2014, the previous World Cup, if I'm not mistaken.
The previous was in Russia, actually, in 2018, but the one before that in South Africa.
Exactly. And during that World Cup, on one of the eves, which it's uncanny that we're talking about this now, but anyway, and one of the evenings, these Al-Shabaab militants came from Somalia. Again, it's in the same area that I made the Paradise Edict painting. And they took out by name 61 men who, a lot of them were in the bars watching the football, and they executed them in the middle of the town. And so I wanted to make a painting that was thinking about the women that were left behind and them coming together in a sort of communal grief. And so this is a group of women who are carrying one of the dead bodies to wrap it, as they were the ones that were left behind.
It seems that this work is less figurative in a way.
Yeah, it kind of became abstract through the making. Like it broke down quite a lot, Yeah.
Right. Move on.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is called San Wukong in Gashie. San Wukong is one of the sort of epics of Chinese literature. It's called the book is called Journey to the West. And Sun Wukong's an interesting character because he's a monkey figure that is extraordinary at learning and goes into a society and will learn all of the skills and be better than anyone there. But he basically wants to live for eternity. and spends his time running around China, learning all these different tasks and destroying everything in his wake. And I was interested in trying to do something that reflected upon Chinese involvement in East Africa, and the way that I was interested in how, in a very different way to colonials and imperial forces before, whether that was the Brits in colonial time or the Americans in more recent time, they always set themselves in a hierarchy where they were only in the top parts of society. Whereas with Chinese involvement, you know, you find the Chinese are also in the slums as well as they are in very affluent parts of the country. And Sun Wukong was interesting because he would be like that. He would go in and be totally disguised and become part of the culture, but destroy everything afterwards, you know. And it was a kind of warning of that. And I wanted to make a painting thinking around that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, doing good. Cool. Antigone, there she is. This was just made thinking about marriage and how in different parts of society in Kenya, it's used as a sort of validification of women, where you only progress to a certain part of acceptance in society once you're married and have a family. And you know, I wanted to do something that was asserting the value of a woman in her own right without necessarily needing to get married. And so this is riffing again off a Greek myth of Antigone from Oedipus the king, where Antigone basically refuses to get married to her uncle, and undermines the whole kind of political system because of that, as he was trying to consolidate power and she refused. And so, yeah, so it's just a painting made around that. But again, using that in a Kenyan context. And again, I was thinking about Gauguin and how his main figure in his paintings was a girl whom he married when I think she was 13 years old. And she appears in a lot of his paintings, the really beautiful paintings, and the problems around that, you know, and she was married off by her family as well. So the composition again riffs off different Gauguin paintings. But yeah.
I've just noticed the sign. I've seen this painting several times, but I never noticed the actual sign on the curtain.
All she wants is to get married.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was taken along with the pose of the figure from a Jack Katarikawe painting. He's an amazing Ugandan painter, and he made a painting of a woman in this pose who had this strange sort of image of a man as well, and it's called All She Wants Is to Get Married. So that was also just a nod towards Jack.
Right, and it seems that it's an important part of process that you use is a constant referencing to various artists, contemporaries and old ones as well, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean that's the sort of gift and the challenge of being a painter is you're part of an extraordinary, you know, multiple millennia long history of making, whether that's from cave paintings to Renaissance to now, whatever it is, you know, like that's what we're part of. And for me, I'm interested in stories, and the references come not only in terms of the narratives of the painting, but also in how the paintings are made. I look at other artists and try and do what they do in certain parts of the paintings to help build a painting or tell a story, or I try and do something in an opposite way to try and undermine that in some way. So yeah, being part of a history like that for me is super important, and that's recognized in the work as well. Is important. Well, it's also just truthful. I steal from them, you know.
And as an image or a symbol, monkey seems to be appearing very often in the paintings.
Yeah, like I said, with the monkey in the promised land, I always feel like they kind of point towards a truth of some sort. You know, like the idea with this was that the veil, which is the curtain, which does have all she wants is to get married, that if the monkey had dropped it, there's a kind of, the parents are proposing to a suitor who's kind of this glowing golden figure in the background. All you would see is that with a curtain that says all she wants is to get married, and the assumption would be that this is a kind of cohesive agreement, but it isn't. And I was kind of thinking the monkeys would be the revealer of that. Yeah.
The revealer. Right.
Yeah, and then this now goes to more recent paintings from the recent group of work that I've had from this year. This painting is called Shiro, Karicho, January 2008. And it was made after I'd been thinking about a story my cousin, who's called Shiro, had told me, where in 2008, when we had our post-election violence, and you had communities turn on each other based on tribal lines. She, as a Kikuyu, was living in a Kalenjin area, and her neighbors basically burnt their houses, and her and the other Kikuyus who were there had to take refuge in a police station, and they slept on the floor of a police cell. And so I just wanted to turn that into a painting. And again, with the layering of the imagery, I was interested in having other aspects of the story being told at the same point. So the idea was this was a police cell, and it looks through, you know, to the back, to the burning houses, which is the background from which they came. On the story of, which I often use, are cave paintings that are a narrative of violence. And on the left, there's a more kind of otherworldly type of cave paintings of these mythical creatures. And on the right is the cave paintings on the wall at the top are from a hunt scene, a war scene. And then you have this kind of imposed figure of a guy gouging the eyes out of himself as the figure comes from his own torso. I don't know if you can make that out, but that's on the right-hand side of the painting. And then he's also stabbing himself in the back. And that was the idea of these two communities from the same country fighting against each other and killing each other, killing themselves. For what?
So it's all made out of the story, yeah, as a composition.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then you have the people who are the refugees in the bottom left-hand corner, who are all kind of walking and homeless as a result of the violence. And we had a lot of internally displaced people as a result of the violence in 2008.
Was it somehow connected to the economic crisis, or?
No, it was just a very closely fought political battle. And the stakes were high, and the people who were the politicians involved were ruthless and merciless, and they fanned tribal flames and then sort of planted their own people and started causing the violence, which then spread and crippled our country. You know, it was pretty horrendous. It's horrendous to see how quickly violence spreads for political means, and also to see your own country fall into that. And again, the same old narratives, the same old stereotypes, and the political figures sitting in a very comfortable place and the rest of the people suffering. Yeah, it's kind of depressing to see that again and again in places all around the world.
Yeah.
And this was another painting. It's kind of like a sister of the other painting, where a friend was telling me about their time in prison in Nairobi, where he was kept in a holding cell, which is the cell you're put in once you've been accused or caught by the police, to the point at which your trial finishes. You're not sent to prison, you're in these holding cells. And he was saying there were so many people in there, they had to sleep with their heads interlocking to fit in the room on the floor. And they were sleeping on a bare concrete floor and given these like these kind of blankets that are full of fleas. And they would usually all sleep with their heads facing one direction, so that they wouldn't be breathing on each other when they were sleeping. I mean, it was such a kind of horrific, a horrific thing, but also so incredibly intimate that all these guys are sleeping together, with their skin pressed against each other every single night for the time that they're there, both horrific and intimate. So that's kind of holding cell. Yeah.
Is this body of work is a kind of a one series that you're working towards a show, or?
Yeah, so I showed this in two exhibitions, one called You Who Are Still Alive in Basel, at the Kunsthalle in Basel. And it's something I've been working on it for about 2.5 years, the show. And it then also, all the paintings went to a show that I had called Amongst the Living in London at White Cube, Bermondsey. That was a couple months ago. So it's been this year, and it's one of, for me, the blessings of the pandemic was having much more time to build the group of paintings together, as all my shows were postponed. Yeah. Yeah, and this is another painting from this group called Dead Soldiers, and it was made from an image of these guys in Congo, who were the kind of rebels in Eastern Congo. And there's a documentary called This is Congo, and there's a point at which the government forces were bringing back a couple of the dead rebels that they had killed, to show that they were from a different nationality, that they were Rwandan as opposed to being Congolese, and they had put them on these poles and put them in the back of a van, and then they just chucked them on the ground afterwards. And I found it kind of an horrific image. So yeah, wanted to make a painting about them, and wanted it to be as crude a painting as I could make. So it's painted very lightly, very fast, and very crudely. Yeah. Yeah, so then I thought I would just say a little bit about the other side of what I've been doing as well, which is NCAI, which stands for the Nairobi Contemporary Arts Institute. I founded this in 2020, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't open. And then this year we've been able to open, and we have it's a not-for-profit art space where we do exhibitions, often the first retrospectives of artists, some of our most well-known artists. A lot of them don't have any sort of market relevance. People don't buy their work, so they're not shown in any capacity. And at home, we don't have a space that is a not-for-profit, non-sales space. And so this really has been about establishing that and starting an institution in Nairobi. And so I thought I'd just show you, our current show is called Mwili Akili na Roho. During the pandemic, when we couldn't open the space, this show, I toured it alongside one of my exhibitions, starting in Germany and then to London, and now it's in Nairobi for the final leg, and it's much more expanded and looks at figurative painting over 50 years, starting from the artists that were the first. There's one of the paintings in the show is from the very first professor, who was an African professor in East Africa at the art school in Uganda, which was the main center for art in our region, and then follows the evolution of that and different types of painting in figurative painting till you get to 2000. So it's over about 50 years through the eyes of 10 artists. But yeah, if you want to keep going, maybe there'll be some images as well. And the other thing, we do a series of films. We also have a postgraduate program that we're starting next year, and a library that we have, as well as offsite programs. So yeah, I just thought I'd share a little bit of this with you. Yeah, so this is Peter Mulindwa, an extraordinary artist, one of my favorite artists, actually. This was from it was actually his MA thesis, where he produced this insane group of 17 paintings. And there was he was important because there was a distinct shift where they went from telling Western stories to looking at the artists who started looking at their own indigenous stories and trying to find ways of painting those stories. But also because of the political situation in Uganda at the time, where there was a lot of censorship on art, they used those traditional stories to get around the censorship, where they would actually challenge a lot of the political ideas through traditional stories. And because it was traditional, the authorities couldn't undermine their own culture. And so they were able to actually make the work and show the work, which is kind of extraordinary, really, in incredibly difficult times. So yeah, that's Peter Mulindwa. Sorry, I've got a mosquito coming from me. Yeah, this is more Peter Mulindwa. Again, an amazing painter.
He's still alive, right?
He's still alive, but he very sadly had a stroke soon after he finished his studies. So these are basically the only surviving paintings of his. I think there's 22 surviving paintings. And then you have Meek Gishugu, who's the youngest of the group of artists that we're showing. And it was interesting seeing how he had taken from those ideas. And again, in a very politically difficult time in Kenya, had really used traditional stories and some socio-political issues to engage in ideas around society. You know, and I mean, the titles are much more kind of close to what's going on, like Nation's Fruit. And a lot of it's about this kind of gluttony, political gluttony, and taking all of the resources of the country to a very small political elite, but expressed through these kind of totally wild paintings that are incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. And this is Meek again. You know, looking at this is one of my favorite paintings ever. I grew up looking at this at a friend's house, and it really, you know, whenever I think I'm making a painting that's challenging, I think does it reach a Meek Gishugu bar of challenging, and it never does. Because this also has a strange, it's called No Erotic Them Say, and it has a very strange kind of Oedipal complex, an Oedipal poem in it about love for his mother, but it's sexual. It's very strange. It's a weird painting, man. You know, but kind of incredible for it. And then all of this started from this moment called The Gathering, where we had 52 artists from 12 countries in Africa come together for 3 days to discuss, you know, things that we had in common and differences, and how we could work together, and just to provide a forum in which people can discuss and talk. And we had artists that were sort of very much internationally recognized, like William Kentridge or Wangeshi Mutu, down to students, all the way through to students from South Africa, from Kenya. And conversations around this are what led to me wanting to open Nkai. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that's the end of the presentation. I hope you're all still awake.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. so much. It's been really fascinating to hear you talking. Right. Questions. So I don't know, I'm going to check what's in the chat. So why Kenya specifically? Well, I guess
yeah, I think I answered that one at the beginning.
Yeah. And do you put the explanations in the text next to the paintings when they're exhibiting?
Not if it's in a commercial gallery, but sometimes if it's in I don't put like how I've talked to you about them. I never put that. You know, I'd only say this in a context of talking to other artists. But sometimes there'll be, you know, institutions have to put something, as most people that come through their doors are not from a sort of art historical background or something. So they will, if it's in a museum, there will sometimes be short texts, but I try to avoid it. I like people to make their own minds up. But
avoid not to direct kind of viewers' interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, you know, it's one of the things that I love is that painting is silent. There's nobody there telling you what you have to see. And although what I've told you are reasons for me to make the paintings, it doesn't limit the paintings to just that. And, you know, one of the things that I like, for example, is, you know, like Mish, how you said with My Dress, My Choice being related to what's going on in Iran. Like for me, that's an important part of paintings, is that someone can come with their own stories, and if the painting speaks to them, for that, to allow for that to happen.
Great. Any questions? Questions in the Zoom? Anybody? Last chance. It's almost 1:30 on Mike's hand, so I guess Mike, I want to really thank you again for finding the time.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Knowing how busy you are, so it's really is amazing. I'm so grateful to you. Always such a great pleasure, and hopefully there's somebody asking how you become such a pro-feminist. I'm not sure whether it's true or not.
You know, like what I would say is that I'm, you know, like my fundamental belief is that we are all the same. I know there's a lot of different societal things that come on top of that, but fundamentally we're all the same, and I feel like everyone should be treated equally. You know, it is the case, and the fact that in most cultures around the world that women are subjugated to a much harder life than men are, and are under much harder pressures. And as a result, in my work, I would like to draw stories to those whose stories don't get told. You know, and women are often at the brutal end of the stories. And that's because that's how society is. You know, so I like, for me, I'd be pro-feminist. I'd be pro anyone that is subjugated or oppressed in some sense, finding a way to not be. And, you know, like my means of existing in this world are through making paintings. And it's a very, very minor way in which, like, I feel like I can draw attention to stories of people that very often are overlooked.
Yeah. Great. Okay, on that note, we're definitely going to let you go. Thank you so much again. It's been a great pleasure.
It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, private chat very soon.
Yeah, absolutely, buddy.
Take care, my
thanks
friend.
so much. Thank you for having me. Take care, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
See you soon.